two-time psych board attendee to successful realtor and life coach. We're talking about living brighter. For more information, go to livebrighter.info or leave a comment and 5-star review for me of this podcast. Today, we're going to talk about the forms of abuse. We've been going through a series of how did I even miss I was in a 22-year domestic abuse situation. And the reason that we're talking about today was the form of abuse. Many of us have a picture in our mind of what we consider abuse, and it usually looks like yelling and screaming and physical abuse, and that seems to be like a common picture in our heads. But actually, abuse can take many different flavors or forms. There is the physical that most of us are more aware of. There's the emotional, there's the psychological, there's the religious, there's the financial. There are so many different forms of abuse that it's so easy to miss it. So, and then even within the forms, you have a very loud, overt abuse, and then you have the very quiet, subtle, manipulative, covert. So there's those two forms. So for me, mine was very passive aggressive and covert, and that is one of the reasons why I missed it, because I wouldn't have thought, oh yeah, that's abuse. I knew my body was reacting and it didn't make me feel good. And it ended up taking such a toll that I ended up in a psych ward, but I didn't recognize it. So again, let's review. So my form was basically like if I brought up a situation or brought up a challenge, I would just be ignored. No matter how nicely or gently I talked about it, ignored for 6 days. And then if I brought it up again, ignored another 6 days. So nothing was ever resolved. Nothing was ever like, I'm sorry. I was always the one saying I'm sorry. But there was nothing ever resolved, and I was always having to stuff those emotions and just choosing to forgive. The problem is those emotions had to go somewhere and do something, even though I was focusing on forgiving and being a good wife and all of those good things. It really took a horrible toll on my body and my mind. So I didn't recognize it because it was very covert, passive aggressive, stonewalling. It's interesting when you look at the root of abuse. The very root of an abuser, as far as their mentality, has to do with very strict role definitions, and it also has to do with objectification of women. I would have thought, yeah, objectification of women makes sense, but I wouldn't have considered the very definitive roles as a precursor to potential abuse. But it makes sense because the church I went to, there was a ton of abuse that was going on, and it came out as these divorces were happening. And it was very, it fit very well within the church what was going on, and that was not a good scenario. So when we're talking about some red flags, especially when you're talking about like what I just mentioned, roles and objectification, objectification would be like if a guy is into porn or making jokes that are very objective, just kind of downgrading women. Those are some red flags. Or if they're very strict, like women have to stay at the home and raise the kids, and this is how it has to be, and women are to submit unequal. If you see inequality in their thinking, that's definitely a red flag as well. Then we have the cycle abuse. So, I think any of us that have been in these abusive or toxic relationships, if how they acted at the end, they acted at the beginning, we would have said, hell no. Get out of here. This is not good. But what an abuser does, and this is, if we see this, I guess, a little bit in all relationships, is they're showing you the good side. They're getting you to care for them, to love them, to have this relationship. And then they bring in a little bit of abuse. And then you justify it, allow it a little bit because you're the kind girl. And then they bring in a little bit more. And it just like gets worse and worse and worse. And then it goes through a cycle. And the cycle is like, here's the honeymoon time, just lovely and wonderful. Then there's the stress. Then there's the abuse. And then it goes round and round. And that's what messes up with, our brains, is because we get in this cycle and it makes it very hard to get out. In fact, usually take women 7 different times to get out of an abusive relationship before they get out. That's the middle time, amount of times it takes for them to get out. And the interesting thing is that cycle abuse, that could go on a couple times in a day, or it could take a decade or even longer. But there's always this cycle of make up, get things back together. It's all good. And then the stress and the tension, and then just really bad. And then it goes in the circle. For me, I had a very long abuse cycle. I had 2 bouts of 5 years that were much, much worse. Just just incredibly much worse. And that's after the 5 years is what triggered me to be like, oh gosh, I can't handle this anymore. I can't understand how someone says they could love me and treat me like that. And that's what led me to stop sleeping, which led me to the psych ward. So what's really sad is once women, and when I say women, honestly, men are in a lot of abusive situations as well. And we'll talk about my husband, my new husband, who is in his own situation. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But what happens is, there's getting out of the situation, which is a lot of work in and of itself. But then there's a very big hurdle as well. And that is like healing your mind and brain and all of that. So you don't get into another flavor of abuse. Because what happens, especially as kind girls, we've got the bullseye on our forehead where we're overgiving, overloving, taking care of others. And it's very easy for us to just go from one abusive relationship to another. So it really takes intentional work to do the healing and retraining process in our brains to keep us from being in another abusive relationship. It's time to change the way you see yourself from God's perspective. Click the link below to get free affirmations and printable affirmations to support you in your Live Brighter journey. So I'll tell you my story. So again, I was married 22 years, got out of it, which was very difficult, and then started hanging around a guy that I'm like, if I had my sensors up, something's off, but I just was so disconnected with myself and so didn't trust myself because I just couldn't understand how I just knew my past husband was the right guy and it could turn out this way. So I was just having some mental challenges with all of that. So I started hanging around with this guy, start dating him. He's just love bombs me and gifts and wonderful things and makes me food dinner, because at the time I wasn't eating a whole lot because I was kind of stressed. And so just pouring out the love. So as I got more and more just liking him, things started to come out. Next thing I know, I'm like, he has a problem with alcohol. Like there's something up with that. And, he was an alcoholic. Next thing I know, especially with alcohol, verbally just berate and abuse. And the interesting thing was my reaction to that. So my reaction was like, gosh, this is a lot better than what I was in, because it was overt. And I could like, hey, he just called me, said I was da-da-da-da-da-da. And at least I know what he's thinking. For me, the covert that I had dealt with in my previous, the stonewalling and the passive aggressive, it was just kind of a brain mess up. And I just, that was very challenging for me. But the point is, I just basically went from a 22-year passive-aggressive, stonewalling, abusive situation to a outright alcoholic, verbally abusive situation. So I get out of that situation, thankfully, and I'm thinking, wow, I'm messed up. I need some work. There's definitely a lot of healing that I need to do. So I was very intentional about healing, because I'm like, wow, yeah, that's not what I want. And there's just some unconscious and subconscious stuff going on that is overriding what I really, really desire. So hence the work started. So for me, the healing part was a lot of not enduring bad behavior. I had to reevaluate my beliefs, my thoughts, my feelings, my relationship with God, all of that. And then I had to get reconnected with myself, because as a kind girl, you're focused on everyone else's needs and emotions and this and that. And I had really gotten disconnected with what matters to myself, what's important, what are my boundaries, what are the things that are like, no way, I'm not going to deal with that. And really started to evaluate getting back in touch with myself and what was important to me, and really seeing myself as an individual and as a beloved child of God that is unique, just like everyone else. And that allows me to be my own person and different. So the healing journey was really in 3 different areas. It first was God and me. In my situation, there was religious abuse that was going on. Submit to your husband, stay together for the kids, just some different things, wives are to honor. If you just pray for your husbands, God will deal with them, and you're not supposed to really rock the boat. All sorts of really weird beliefs. So I had to really dive into, what does God really say? Who is God really in his, rather than having other people define that, other preachers, having my husband define all of that. What does God's word really say about all of that? Who is his character? How does he feel about abuse? How does he feel about trauma? all of that. So I needed to reconnect that whole relationship. And then there was the relationship with myself. So that was a whole process in and of itself to get reconnected with all my thoughts, feelings, with my body, all of those things. And then past that, my relationship with others. So I remember going to my counselor and being like, wow, I just dated this guy and I realized I've got a really, really low bar and I don't even know what a healthy relationship marriage looks like. So he was really helpful in giving me some tools and some things that helped me out. And I was greatly appreciative of that. So that's one reason why I wrote the Unravel notebook, which hopefully will be out soon, is because it's basically a notebook of journal prompts just in those areas I just talked about. You and God, you and self, you and others. And then the back half of the Unravel notebook is the Barf notebook. And that was a super important tool for me to get reconnected with myself. And the Barf notebook was about 3-step process, which is barf it out, like just barf out all the emotions and feelings. And for me, I was so good about like thinking about the positive and justifying bad ideas and all of those things that I wasn't being honest with really how I thought, felt to the core was the first challenge. So barfing it out. And then the next step was sorting it out through items like, okay, what is true? And all of those things and what, is about my past and what's coming up. And really just sorting it out. And then the third step was planning it out. So basically, I was being very mindful about planning and thinking about how to move forward in these different challenges and ways of thinking for me. So that was the 3-part step of my Barf notebook. So that was barf it out, sort it out, and plan it out. And that was really healing and connecting. Another thing that was a big deal for me is sitting with negative emotion. And I think I was wonderful about numbing and buffering, which will be in the next episode. But sitting with negative emotion was a very difficult thing. And first of all, you have to quiet yourself. You really have to just okay, sit with it. It's very important to know that emotions are information. It's your body telling you information. It's also just a vibration. Like an emotion is just a vibration in your body caused by a thought. So just allowing yourself to feel it, like I had to train myself to feel it, to kind of identify it, to kind of understand it, but not to be afraid of it, because I really did not like negative emotion and negative circumstances. So really training myself to sit with it was a process in and of itself. What I learned with emotions and circumstances and thoughts is they need to be dealt with. They can't be avoided or buffered or ignored or any of those things. They actually have to be processed and dealt with. And that is something a lot of us haven't learned how to do, especially as kind girls, because we're busy serving. So that is one of the reasons why I was in an abusive relationship. It's because the form of abuse, and there's so many forms. I mean, even forms within those forms. There's so many varieties. Did you know that you can have sexual abuse in marriage? That there is such a thing as rape within marriage? There's all sorts of forms of abuse. Religious, are they using it to power and control? Economic, are they using money to keep you and hold you captive? It's very difficult to get out of these relationships, partly just because, the mind-bending things that are going on, but also with it, there's consequences. There's okay, is there some financial, is there some social consequences? All sorts of things. Do we have children? Do we have this? Are we worried about lots of things? And for me, what was out at the root of it, my challenge as far as even really understanding I was in an abusive situation, is I really loved my husband. And I had this unrealistic hope that things would get back to the way they were when they were good. And those can be super toxic. So I'm just going to say that because love, and we'll talk about this later, but, love in a relationship is mutual. It's, it's raising both people up. It's not one person controlling or one person always being wrong or, that's really not love. And I had to really redefine that for myself and understand that. I believe in you. You know your own experience. I believe that if you explore this more, or if you know somebody that's been in this situation, just understanding a little bit more about it can give you the tools to help someone else. I believe in you. Live brighter and make it a great day.